computer. All right, so welcome everyone to this Ecology and Evolution seminar from Australian National University. We're recording it today, so those of you who can't attend in person are now able to watch this. It's a great pleasure to have Mike Ryan here today. Mike is speaking to us today from the People's Republic of Austin in Texas, a bastion of sanity and a sea of madness. Now, I think Mike is known as an absolute star in the evolutionary biology world. I realized that for the last 4 decades, he's been publishing papers in Science and Nature, 4 decades of doing that, which is incredible. And if he publishes something in the next year or two, that'll be 5 decades, which is truly phenomenal. Since the 1970s, Mike's been working in Panama at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, where he's now a senior research associate, but his home base is at the University of Texas in Austin. Now, I know Mike as a field biologist, but there's a major part of Mike's work which is also laboratory-based and interested in neurobiology and psychophysics, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that today, and I won't steal his thunder. But all I really wanted to emphasize is that Mike's one of those people that asks questions at every level of the biological hierarchy and is fabulously successful at doing so. His list of achievements is way too long to mention, so I'm not really going to go through the full list. Except lots of medals, fantastic mentor, over 25 PhD students graduated, numerous books. Here is the latest book, A Taste for the Beautiful. And at the end, I will find some way to give away a free copy of this now that it's arrived in my house. I can now pass on a free copy of this to one of the PhD students in the department. So we'll find a way to do that. One last thing I have to say about Mike very quickly is when I knew he was speaking, I thought, oh, what is a story that connects me to Mike? And I realized I have this famous shaggy dog story I tell people, which involves going to the Darien Gap in Panama and a very long trip where we got trapped there. And the reason we were there is because we had to go and collect frogs, and Mike was paying us $5 a frog. And at the time, that seemed like an excellent idea. And I've often thought people won't believe me that when I tell the shaggy dog story, because it involves getting trapped and our hotel burning down and flying in a military helicopter. And I actually found a photo. So if anyone can see that, what you can see there is that is La Palma in the Darien, and that is the flames as our hotel burns to the ground, having finally reached there after 3 days trying to get out of a very small town.
I know exactly where that is.
Yeah. And just as another total piece of trivia to remind people the world, things can get better in these grim times, that picture immediately above it, I realized was taken by Pat, my partner, at the rally when Nelson Mandela was released, and we went off to see Nelson Mandela being released. So if you'd told the person in that picture 6 months before that apartheid would be ending, he wouldn't have believed it. And a few months later, the world had changed, at least for him and the people of South Africa. So just remember that things can get better. And I think on that positive note, I'm going to hand over to Mike. So thank you so much for doing this, Mike. We look forward to it.
Okay, and thank you. Even though I can't see most of you, I believe that you're there, and thanks for showing up. It's about 7 in the evening here. We should get done before it's dark, and it's, I forgot my centigrade. It's about close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit here. So it's also pretty warm. Oh, whoa. Michael, this is, I have to do it like this? Yes, yep. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about are a series of studies that address the general question that Darwin suggested. And that is, why have animals evolved courtship traits that appear in most cases to be maladaptive for survival? And he wrote a letter in the 1860s to a famous botanist in North America. And he said, every time I gaze at a peacock's tail, it makes me sick. Now we know Darwin was a hypochondriac, But this sickness, I think, was probably from cognitive dissonance. He had just developed this beautiful theory of evolution by natural selection, explaining how populations evolve traits that favor survivorship. And then he was faced with all of this amazing diversity in nature. And even without data, it was just hard to believe that a lot of these traits actually promoted survivorship. And so he came up with this idea of sexual selection. And that's what we've been investigating, as Michael said, for quite a long time. And most of our studies have been centered on this frog in Panama. And this is the Tungura frog. And I started these studies actually when I was a graduate student. I guess that suggests a lack of imagination and creativity. But I started those studies here on Barrow, Colorado Island, which is a biological reserve in the middle of the Panama Canal. And that's where I did most of the early studies. And then we moved on to the mainland in Panama, where these Tungura frogs were much more abundant. Now, these are small frogs. They're only about 30 millimeters long. They're probably the most common, certainly the most conspicuous frog through much of Middle America. And they're actually a South American species that moved into Panama before the Panamanian land bridge, which you don't really understand that. But there's been two invasions of Tungura frogs into Middle America. One about 5 million years before the Panama land bridge rose, and then another about 3 million years ago when the land bridge was kind of complete. So these guys, they breed during the wet season. And in Panama, the rainy season is usually from May until December. And they congregate in small pools where the males call to attract females. So it's really a standard kind of lek-like mating system. The males call, they really don't ambush females. The females get to move around the males and they get to choose the males. So this is what a real one looks like. Now there's about 6,000 species of frogs, and all frogs have a species-specific long-distance mating call, or at least almost all of them do. And their call is shown on the bottom left here. The blue are waveforms that shows how call energy changes with time. Below that are sonograms. Now, the reason that I started studying these frogs, and I should point out that these are collaborations with Stanley Rand, who passed away a while ago, but we worked together for decades on these frogs. He was a staff scientist at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. These frogs have a call that varies in complexity. Now, it's not nearly as complex as a bird's song, but it's fairly complex for a frog. So if we look at the top left, that we refer to as a whine, and all of the calls have whines, and then the frogs can add chucks to these calls. So I'm going to play these calls here, these 4 calls, so you can hear how they vary in complexity. What's interesting is if you come across one of these males who's kind of isolated, calling by himself, he produces only a whine. Now, if you say to the male, he's making a whine, ear, ear, and if you say to the male, ear, then he answers you. You don't even have to be good at this. And his answer will be, ear, Now, if you say back, ear, then he'll respond, ear, and they can make up to 7 of these chucks. But they only add chucks to their calls when they're competing with other males. So a question that we asked early on was, why are these males varying the complexity of their call? What is this chuck all about? Because the whine by itself is necessary and sufficient to attract a female for mating, but males add these chucks to their calls. So the key experimental approach that we take mostly is these phonotaxis experiments. So I have a frog lab in Panama, and we have a walk-in acoustic chamber, and we can do phonotaxis with these frogs, where we collect females in the field at a breeding site. So they're always reproductively primed, which is really important because if they're not reproductively primed, then you usually have to inject them with hormones. That's how most bird studies are done. And that's adding a variable that can be pretty tricky. We bring these females in from the field and we close them up in this acoustic chamber, and then we play them calls from speakers. And the simplest experiment is two speakers. And we ask the females, which call do you prefer? Now remember, they were just ready to mate. In fact, they have to drop their eggs that night. So they're really primed to choose a male. And the females will travel to one of the speakers and usually make contact with the speakers trying to get the male. So we can ask this very simple question of the females: which call do you prefer, A or B? Or we've used up to 6 speakers sometimes. Or we can just use a single speaker and ask the female, if you were to hear this call, would it be salient? Would it indicate a potential mate? So we did these experiments giving females a choice between a whine from one speaker and a whine chuck from another speaker. And the bottom left-hand graph, this is just published last year in the American Naturalist. This summarizes these whine chuck preferences with females over 19 consecutive years. And this is showing over 5,000 female choices. And what we see is it's pretty consistent. And the probability of the female preferring the whine chuck versus the whine, and we do this particular experiment with synthetic calls. So every year the females are getting exactly the same pair. And the probability of them responding to the whine chuck in favor of the whine is 0.86. So what that means is that females have a 5-fold preference for calls with chucks. Now, we've measured the metabolic cost of producing a chuck. And there's nothing, it doesn't cost them anything to do that. And we've done biomechanical models of this system, and we know how they produce a chuck. I'll show you later. They evolved this particular structure right on their vocal cords that allows the chuck. But think about us. Think about all the money that goes into perfumes, cosmetic surgeries. Is there anything that we could possibly do to ourselves to make ourselves 500% more sexually attractive than we are now, and to do it for free? And the answer is, well, if you can think of something, don't tell me, patent it, because it would be very popular. But so this tells us why males make chucks, because it really increases their sexual attractiveness. But now we can ask, well, then if metabolically it's not costing anything, why don't males always make chucks? Because as I said, they're only going to make chucks when they're forced to by vocal competition with other males. And this is the answer as to why males don't always make chucks. So that's the frog-eating bat, Trichopterosis. Its common name is the fringe-lip bat. And when I was a graduate student, Merlin Tuttle, who's a famous bat biologist, discovered that he caught one of these bats in a mist net with a frog in its mouth. So Merlin and I started working together, and we showed that frogs are one of the important components of this bat's diet. And the way the bats find the frogs is not by using their echolocation system, which they can, but it's by homing in on the call of the frogs. We did behavioral audiograms of the bats, and because they have ultrasonic calls that they use for echolocation, which are in the case here, it's about 50,000 hertz. all of the energy in the Tungra frog's call is below 5,000. We always thought bats couldn't hear those calls. But when we do behavioral audiograms with the bats, we see there's a second peak of sensitivity down around where frog calls are. We also did some neuroanatomical studies, and there's adaptations in the ear of this bat to allow them to both hear ultrasonic calls that are in their echolocation range as well as the frog calls. So females prefer calls with chucks, and they prefer more chucks. And the reason they don't make more chucks all the time is because bats also prefer chucks. So frogs are, if you look at the picture in A, if you see where it says FM, this is a really large structure that's unique to just a few frogs, and it's attached to the vocal cords. That's what makes the chuck. We've done experiments where we can actually, even though the frogs are only 30 millimeters long, we can cut that off and then the chuck disappears. Now the frogs have two inner ear organs. One's called an AP, the other called a BP, and they hear different frequencies, and the whine matches the sensitivity of the AP, and the chuck matches the sensitivity of the BP. And we have a pretty good understanding of what happens in the brain that makes them find the chucks more attractive. Now, what's interesting is the Tungra frog, pustulosis, they make chucks. The sister species, Peter's eye, makes chucks. None of the other close relatives makes chucks. So I've done a lot of neurobiology with my colleague, Walt Wolzinski. And what we showed is that if you look here, all of these other species make calls that sound like whines. They're all different. And the tuning of their AP matches their whine. But they don't make chucks. They don't have any energy up here by this basilar papilla. But if we look at the tuning of the basilar papilla, it's all the same, except for this species here. So what this tells us is that the chuck evolved in an ancestor of pustulosis and Peter's eye, the Tungra frog and its sister. But this tuning of the BP that the chuck matches has been in place for millions of years. So what that says is when they evolved the chuck, this match between the chuck and that inner ear organ is because that inner ear organ was always tuned like that, even though it wasn't used in communication. And the males then later evolved a call that would trigger this sensory organ. And we call that sensory exploitation when males evolve traits that take advantage of pre-existing biases. Now, but what I don't want to talk about the brain too much. I want to talk more about cognition in these guys. And what we want to know is the females prefer more chucks to fewer chucks. We want to know something about how they compare that. Because in most of these mate choice by sexual selection systems, females prefer traits that are of greater magnitude. They prefer longer tails to shorter tails, brighter colors to duller colors, more complex birdsong repertoires to less complex. So we can get an idea of how the frogs might be comparing quantities by looking at how we compare quantities. So I'm going to show you a slide with clouds of points, and I want you to raise your left hand if you think there's more points on the left, and the right hand if there's more on the right. Ready? And you can count. Okay, so there's more points on the left. There's 6 and 5. So there's one more on the left than there is on the right. And the proportional difference there is 0.2. Okay, ready? Another one? More on the left or more on the right? Yeah, it's a little closer. But again, there's more on the left. There's one more on the left than there is on the right, and the proportional difference here is only 0.08. It's only an 8% difference. Okay, last one. What about that? Okay, the answer is still on the left. There's one more on the left, and the difference here is only 2%, 0.02. So this is called Weber's law. What Weber's law says is that when we make comparisons between magnitudes of stimuli, this was first done in humans, we're usually making comparisons based on proportion, not on absolute differences. So Weber said that there will be a constant that's needed for what they call just noticeable differences to discriminate between two stimuli. And this constant K equals the difference between the two stimuli divided by the overall magnitude. So what that means is that if as I gets larger, then delta I has to increase to keep K constant. So this was done a while ago by one of my then grad students, Karen Acre. So we asked with the Tugra frogs, females prefer more chicks to fewer chicks. Are they following Weber's law? Or are they making linear comparisons? If they're making linear absolute comparisons, then the strength of the preference for example, 6 chucks versus 5 chucks should be as strong as the preference for 2 versus 1. On the other hand, if they're making proportional differences, then females should find 2 chucks much more attractive than 1 chuck than 6 chucks compared to 5 chucks. So we have this very straightforward prediction about whether they're following something like Weber's law. So when we did a bunch of experiments giving females 2 calls that varied in chuck number. And what we see is on the y-axis, it's the proportion of females that preferred the call with more chucks. And what you see in almost all the cases, females prefer calls with more than 1 chuck. But on the x-axis, on the top graph, we plot the data where we plot the difference in the absolute difference in the numbers of chucks of the 2 stimuli. And we see that the difference in the number of chucks does not explain a significant variation in the strength of preferences. But if we plot the ratio of the number of chucks, then we see that explains 84% of the variation in the female preferences. So in short order is that these females are following a Weber's-like function. So we can ask, why are they doing this? And there's 2 general possibilities. One is that there's an honest signaling that this kind of comparison evolved because it's an adaptive mate choice strategy. And one can imagine that if the number of chucks were correlated to, let's say, good genes, then the difference between males making 2 versus 1 chuck might be substantial. But once males are making many, many, many chucks, the difference in quality between them might be small. So we call that the honest signaling hypothesis. And then the contrast would be what we call a cognitive constraints hypothesis. And that says females follow this pattern of using proportional differences because they're a vertebrate and they have a vertebrate brain, and this is how vertebrates use their brain. So in that they're just doing what a lot of other animals do, including humans. So how do we compare these hypotheses? Well, one way is to get another animal that responds to numbers of chucks, but in a very different domain. So then we go back to these bats again. And the bats prefer calls with more chucks to fewer chucks, but the bats are looking for a meal. They're not looking for a mate. So we do exactly the same experiments with the bats. And what we see is on the top right, the difference in the number of chucks, the absolute difference does not explain a significant variation in the preference of the bats for more chucks. But if we look at the ratio of the number of chucks, the proportion of the number of chucks, then what we see is they're also following a Weber function And that Weber function is statistically indistinguishable from the preference function of the females. And on the right here, you see Rachel Page. She was one of my grad students in the past who worked on these frog-eating bats. Now she's a staff scientist in Panama at STRI, and she's the one who did the bat parts of this experiment. So what we see here then is that when the females are making these comparisons, they're doing these proportional comparisons. They're following a Weber-like function, not a linear function. And that suggests that this is just a general cognitive bias. I wouldn't even say a constraint, but they're doing what the bats are doing just because that's how vertebrates often make comparisons, number one. And number two, if you compare the rate of evolution of male traits in simulations where females are doing Weber-like comparisons or linear comparisons, doing Weber-like comparisons really slows down the evolution of large magnitude in sexually selective traits. So we do know that sexual selection can cause the evolution of more chucks here or longer tails and peacocks, but natural selection is going to put a brake on that, right? Because the survivorship decreases as these traits get more increased in magnitude. Well, here what we're suggesting is that there's also a cognitive brake that slows down the evolution of these traits. Okay, another kind of cognitive phenomenon that we've looked into is this really odd phenomenon that's named after a country western song. And this guy, James Pennybacker, was a faculty member, University of Virginia, and he knew this western song, "Don't the Girls Get Prettier at Closing Time?" So he took this seriously and he went out to these bars with his grad students. And he had the grad students in the beginning of the night rate the sexual attractiveness of same gender and other gender people, patrons at the bar. This was done in the 70s. The assumption was that everybody was heterosexual. And what they found was that the perception of people's attractiveness of other genders increased as you got closer to closing time, but not of your gender, only of opposite gender. So there's a variety of personality psychology hypotheses, but the one that seems to have most valence is cognitive dissonance. So the idea, as they explain it, is you get this, it's a country western song, you get this cowboy going to the bar. This is a little misogynistic, this song, but he's going to the bar, he wants to pick up a woman and he's looking for a 10. And what this song is, throughout this song, is getting later and later at night, and his standards are getting lower and lower, and he ends up going home with a 1 instead of a 10. Now, somebody pointed out that these people at the bar are drinking, as I am now. And they said, well, maybe it's just an effect of alcohol. So one of the places where they drink a lot more beer than even the United States is Australia. So people in Australia repeated this study, and they took blood alcohol measures of people, the ones doing the rating, early in the night and late at night. And what they found, no surprise, the more alcohol you had in your blood, the more attractive people looked, or opposite gender people look. But if you use blood alcohol as a covariate, you still get this closing time effect. So we thought, well, what about frogs? They're not that different from undergraduates. So I think I pointed out that we collect these frogs in the field. The females only come to the mating aggregation when they're going to mate. If they don't get a male that night, they drop their eggs. And it takes 6 weeks for them to yolk up another clutch. And they only live a year. So what we did is we have these synthetic calls, a conspecific call and a hybrid call. And the hybrid call is a synthetic call, and it's in between a tundra frog call and the call of another species. And they don't like hybrid calls. So with the females, we do this simple test. We just play them one call. Will you go to this call? And we knew ahead of time the answer is going to be no. Usually it's only about 10% of the females would approach that call. The rest ignore it. So we bring these females in and we test them early in the night, and only 15% of the females will approach the hybrid call. Now we hold the females until about 2 o'clock in the morning, very close to when they would start to drop their eggs and give up about getting a mate. And now what we see is that the proportion of females that now find this call attractive increases significantly. It's over 40%. And not only that, their urgency increases. They're making these choices a lot faster. So as with these cowboys at the bar, their standard of acceptance, their acceptance threshold changes as they get closer to when they would have to drop their eggs. So not only do the girls at the bar get prettier at closing time, like this guy Mickey Gilley predicted, but the male tundra frog calls, they get more attracted to the females. And in other experiments, the person who headed these experiments, Kathleen Lynch, showed that this was all estrogen based. So estrogen goes up as they're about to drop the eggs. And what Kathleen showed later in another study is that if you inject females with estrogen, then they're more likely to go to these calls. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about, which is very simple, is this idea of a sexual marketplace. So when females of most species are going to these lek-like aggregations to choose a male, there are usually a number of males that they're comparing, right? Now, the way female preference has been modeled for years is that there's a preference function, and the preference function, you're assigning a utility to one of the males, and then you compare the utilities, you compare the preference scores, and that determines your decision. Now, that whole approach is taken from economics, because we know in studies of human economics, we place utility on value, on objects, think consumer objects, and then we use these utility to decide how to make purchases. Now, one of the assumptions of this economics approach is called irrelevant alternatives. So the idea is that when a female compares male A and male B, the perceived difference between A and B should be the same whether or not male C is present. So there's this really cool study done with students at MIT, and this is true. When the Economist started to publish online, you could purchase an online subscription for $59 US dollars, a print subscription for $125, or you could get the print and the online together for $125. So they asked these students at MIT, well, and they're smart, what would you prefer? So 16% said they would prefer the online, and none of them said that they would prefer the print subscription. Why get only the print if you can get the print in the online? So 84% preferred the print in the online. Okay, so none of the students preferred the print only. Now you redo that experiment and you say to the students, if you only have the choice between the online and the print and online, what are you going to prefer? Since the print by itself, nobody preferred that, you think these percentages would stay kind of the same, but look how they change. So in this context, the print subscription is the least attractive, and that's called a competitive decoy. Now we're running out of time, so I don't want to go into the sensory comparisons. But this this effect of irrelevant alternatives has been well known, and it influences how storekeepers will place objects on the shelves. So they can really bias the decision of the consumers. So then we asked if there's this type of irrationality in Tugra fronts. Very simple experiment. We take 3 calls, and we show them here, B, A, and C. And these are actual calls. And from previous studies, we know their relative attractiveness. So we're going to call dimension 1 their static attractiveness. So some calls are just more attractive than others. But then what we can do is we can vary the playback rate of the calls, because females prefer calls of faster repetition rates than slower. So what we do here is we plot out the calls, the target call, the competitor call, and the decoy. So we see here the decoy is the least attractive, okay? So we do 2 speaker experiments, and we give them A versus B. We test 40 females, and what we see is that there's not a significant preference between them. So now we do an experiment with 3 speakers. And now we introduce call C, which again is very unattractive. And now we ask, what's the preference between A and B? And the preference should be the same if they're showing economically rational choice. And that's not what we see. So in the binary choice, they weren't significantly different, but more females preferred B to A. And now if we include C, which almost none of the frogs went to, now we see that this changes their preference for A. So what we see is that they're violating this assumption that irrelevant alternatives have no effect. They're violating this assumption that when they're doing these comparisons, they're assigning absolute utility values to them. So there was one last section, but since we're running out of time, I just wanted to say that I cover a lot of these topics in this book that came out, I guess it's 2018 now. And Darwin said that females prefer these traits because his explanation for why they had these preferences was they had sexual aesthetics. Like us, and this is a quote from him, they had a taste for the beautiful. So this book is written for a general audience, and it's not just about the Tugra frogs. I go through lots of different examples and try to point out that if we want to understand the evolution of sexual attractiveness, what we have to start concentrating is not only on the male signal, where most of the focus has been, but how do females view, how do they perceive, how do they analyze these signals? So not only is beauty in the eye of the beholder, but I argue that beauty is in the brain of the beholder. So sorry about this glitch. Again, Michael.
Can you hear me, Mike?
I can hear you.
Okay, that's fantastic. I'm very glad to hear you can hear me. I've never seen anyone that pleased to hear me. Most people have the exact opposite emotion, but there you go. Great. So you can hear us. So what I suggest we do now is if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand and I will turn on your microphone and you can then ask a question. Meanwhile, in the interim, if anyone on the panel who's up on the screen there wants to ask a question while people pluck up their courage.
I have a question.
Thanks, Megan.
Can you hear me? Mike, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great talk, thank you. I can't figure out how to write a question, so.
Well, you don't need to now.
Yeah, this works. So I was wondering in the last part of your talk when you were talking about how the kind of the perception or how the different males around them changes the choice of the females. Do you, or have you looked at whether males actually change who they associate with to try and increase their attractiveness at all?
That's a really good question. And when we have looked at that in the field, no really clear patterns emerge. But in the laboratory, if we can play calls to males, and they don't give phonotactic responses as readily, but they will show phonotactic responses. And what we found is that the small males will go to speakers producing calls of larger males.
Okay.
So the small males will go to the larger males. Now, what we don't get in this system are well-defined non-calling satellite strategies.
Mm-hmm.
So over time, and when I was a grad student, I monitored, male mating success and calling. I think it was like 186 consecutive nights, mostly the whole breeding season. And all the males called during the breeding season. So you don't get males that never call, but you do get males that on a certain night, they're not going to call that much. So we do think that the smaller males will hang around the larger males who are more attractive to the females.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Hi, can I ask a question? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Hi, Mike. So what does a female gain by choosing a male who's making more chucks? I mean, obviously he's taking the risk of being eaten by a bat, but does that vary between individual males, or is he signaling, what's honest about the signal that he's conveying to her? I mean, it could just be stupidity.
There's two possibilities. One possibility is that when larger males produce lower pitched chucks, and those lower pitched chucks match the tuning of that inner ear better. They're closer to the peak sensitivity. Now, when females choose larger males, they get more of their eggs fertilized. It's not because of anything inherent in the male. So in most frogs, females are a bit larger than males. Now they have external fertilization. So the female is extruding eggs and the male is extruding sperm. And if the male is a lot smaller than the female, the sperm is getting on her back and not on the eggs. So being teleological, the females want a male that's larger because they fertilize more eggs. There's a guy, as I was doing my thesis study, his name, Robertson, I'm blanking on his first name, who studied Jeremy Robertson did this beautiful study in Australia where the frogs were even more specific. There was size assortative mating, and it was motivated by the same thing. So that's one possibility. There's another really intriguing possibility. And what people are showing now is that in humans and maybe in some other animals, you experience hedonic pleasure from certain signals or viewing certain paintings. And when you view a painting that's easy for you to decode neurally, it's called using sparse coding, so you don't need to recruit a whole lot of neurons. And these paintings have spatial statistics that match the background. Then if you do fMRIs on people, the dopamine reward system lights up more when they're looking at those paintings. For us, there's areas in the tumor frog's brain, in the dopamine reward system, that show more neural activity when there's chucks. So this one area, there's two areas where we see this. One's called the nucleus accumbens. One is called the VTA. And both of these are, have analogs, if not homologs in humans. But this idea of hedonic pleasure, Bob's old advisor and my old student, Gil Rosenthal, wrote a wonderful paper last year, the year before, on hedonic value. And there's also been a lot of other papers coming out in this field called neuroaesthetics. So this idea has only been around, I've only known about it for 6 months. And it's a really fascinating idea that it might be that some of these signals are just more pleasurable than
Are
others.
they more pleasurable because they're hardwired because of some adaptive advantage in the past?
Maybe or maybe not. And how do we tell the difference, right? How do we, so yeah, it's certainly possible that in all cases what animals find pleasurable was at one time hooked into an adaptive advantage. So that's certainly possible. But another possibility is that, and it does seem less likely at first blush, is that as we get derived pleasure from certain kinds of non-sexual stimuli, this also might be happening with other animals as well. And there's a beautiful series of studies by this guy, Purvis, and he's trying to understand why do we find certain pairs of notes, like on a piano keyboard, more consonant, more attractive than others. And what he finds is it's predicted by this kinds of sounds that we make in speech. And so his argument is that our acoustic system has evolved to tune into these frequency peaks in speech. And this is why we find these tones. There's nothing adaptive. Well, he doesn't say this, but he says there's probably something adaptive about liking these pairs of tones, but there doesn't need to be. It could just be the pleasure in itself. Now, so this is a radical idea, and it hasn't been around that long. But it's a really fun one. It's a really fun one to think about. Now, of course, if following your aesthetic preferences was maladaptive, then you'd really expect selection to just dump it, to weed it out. But everything else being equal. And then finally, another adaptive possibility is that with the chuck, you're giving the female more information from more sensory channels, and it gets her reproductively primed faster, so it reduces search cost. Because these are really dangerous places for these frogs to hang out. And it's not just the bats, it's snakes, and it's turtles, and it's crabs, and it's opossums, and it's mastella, it's everything. These are like little floating hamburgers. And anybody that eats meat and that's hungry goes to these places. And Michael's seen it, they just pop these things in their mouth. Anything will eat these.
Right.
I don't see any hands going up, so I'll just wait 1 second, and if not, I'll ask a question. We do have one. We have a question
There's a study that shows both birds and humans have a preference for harmonic. Oh, maybe I need to click on it to see the rest of it.
Chloe, if you'd like to ask a question, just put up your hand, and then I will turn your microphone on. If not, okay, yes, you do. All right, so this is Chloe Tan is going to ask you a question.
Hi, Mike. Great talk. I just have a question about irrational choices. So what do you think that organisms make irrational choices, for example, with irrelevant substitutes? Do you think it's an adaptive behavior, or do you think that we would evolve cognitive mechanisms that would allow us to make more rational choices in the future?
Yeah, I think in general it's adaptive, and to figure it out, what you need to do is break down the attractiveness into different traits or different dimensions. So if you have two stimuli that can be attractive, and one's very loud and the other is very soft, and then one is of a slightly lower frequency, one's of a slightly higher frequency, then if you get in one of these decoys, it amplifies or it minimizes the difference between the two ones that you're comparing it to. So that's one hypothesis as to how these work. So what happens is you're expanding the scale along one dimension, but not the others. So two stimuli, whatever they can be cameras that look very similar. Now, if you expand that scale, they're going to look even more similar. If you have individuals that are a bit different and you expand that scale, then the difference is also going to be perceived differently. So I think it's adaptive because I think it's a way, it gives you extra information in making these kinds of comparisons. And I'm sorry, that's not the most concise explanation of it, but in short, the competitive decoy brings stimuli into play, and now even though they're not attractive, they can contract or expand the range of the stimuli that you're comparing.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps I could ask a question because I don't see another hand up. So Mike, showing the decoy effect in the Tangara frogs is pretty cool. And it's a nice reversal of the usual logic of saying that animals are totally rational and then applying this to humans. You know, that usual argument of, that sort of approach to evolutionary psychology, to go backwards from these are crazy things humans do animals do them? I think it's interesting, but it does beg a question as to, of all the kind of cognitive biases we know about in humans, which of them do occur and which don't occur in animals? And have you given a thought to that? And I'll raise one specific example people will be familiar with, the Concord fallacy or sunken costs in economics. Now, I would imagine that would be a really maladaptive thing for animals to do, but I'd be intrigued if you have done any research or know of any research showing that this occurs in animals, that they make the Concord fallacy in their behavior.
Well, yeah, they do. They do. And Stan Rand had shown this. And there's a little island, Michael, right next to BCI. I mean, it's tiny. It's like about, 15 meters long by 10 meters wide. And iguanas have communal nests there. And what Stan and some others showed is that the intensity in which females will defend that nest, it takes a while to dig the burrow, and then they put their eggs at the very end, is based on the amount of time that they've put into it. So they published that right when Dawkins was coining this term, Concord fallacy, and then Dawkins was down, and then Maynard Smith came down, and they both said, they can't. Why do they do that, Stan? They're not supposed to do that. Why do they show the Concord fallacy? And Stan said, because they're lizards. So that is one example of a Concord fallacy. I don't know of others because I don't follow that particular one.
Yeah.
But John Endler did these really nice studies with the bowerbirds on this perceptual illusion on forced perspective. Now that's not irrational, but it also shows how these higher cognitive level biases in humans. So, the way the forced perspective works is that you look at a building, right? And it has windows on each story going higher and higher and higher. When we look at these windows, we're assuming that all the windows are the same size, and the ones on the top of the building look smaller because they're farther away. So in Disneyland, where they made one of these castles decades ago, they wanted the castle to look big and imposing. So what they would do is on every floor, they would make the windows smaller, and the buildings would appear larger. And then Endler has, I don't know if you guys know this I mean, I know that you and Bob certainly know it, this Bowerbird study, where they place objects where they vary the size. So the courting area, it appears larger to females because of the order in which they put the size of these rocks. So that's another one. And then in humans, again, this isn't as much irrational as perceptual. There's this famous McGurk effect. So they show people a video and the lip movements don't match the sound that's coming out. So the person will be pronouncing a phoneme. I forget what they are. Let's say pa. The lips are saying pa. The sound you're hearing is da. And then, well, the sound that's coming out, I should say, of the computer is da. And then you ask the person what they're hearing, and they're hearing ga. And you can do this, and there's a lot of YouTube videos where you can do this. So we've shown with the Tungura frogs, they pay attention to the vocal sac. And we've shown that if you displace the timing of the vocal sac with the call, then it changes the female's perceptions. Another one, again, not irrational, but mate choice copying. We know in humans that if you ask people to rate the attractiveness, usually it's female rating men. If you show them a picture of a man by himself, and then in another group of women, you show a picture of that man with a woman, then their rating of that guy goes up if they see him with the woman. And then the utility of the model, the attractiveness of the woman that he's with also influences that attractiveness rating. And we've shown with fishes, with mollies, that there's mate choice copying, and other people have shown it. It's actually been shown an awful lot in animals. So there's a whole, so the other, and then but the only other one, Michael, that I can think of in terms of the rationality is transitivity. So we haven't published anything on transitivity. And the one thing that we have published with this guy, Mark Kirkpatrick, it looks like they're statistically not really transitive, but they're also not really intransitive. And other people in our department have done studies with fishes, and they do appear to be transitive. But there's other studies, I'm blanking on them right now. There are some other studies where they appear to be not transitive.
Well, I think that's a good list to get started on. I think just an interesting area, and I don't know of a thorough review of it. I haven't looked, but I suspect there's a lot there to think about for people, and I can see in an age of financial difficulties, doing something of interest to economists might be a good idea. And so it would be an interesting way for biologists to interact with economists, and the most interesting parts of economics, perhaps for us, the sort of behavioral economics and irrational choice and all these little tricks and nudging and so on. I think it would be interesting for biologists to get involved in that kind of work a little bit more, because I'm sure there's a lot we can learn from animals. Hey, Mike, I think we should probably end it here because you've been going for almost an hour and a half now. And look, firstly, thank you so much for doing this. I realize the technical issues made it extremely challenging, but you were a trooper to get back on and carry on.
But at least it did work.
One last thing. I do have a copy of your book. Now, I'm not quite sure how to do it. So I'll tell you what, there are PhD students out there on the list. No, you can't have it, Megan. There are PhD students in the attendees. The first one to put their hand up gets the book. It was Juliana Musoe. So Juliana, if you send me an email, Michael Jennings, I will then arrange for you to get a copy of this book. And I wish Mike was here in person, then he could sign it for you and make it even more personal, but that's not going to happen. But nonetheless, Juliana, you have won a copy of this wonderful book, and I hope you enjoy it. And I think
Mike, am I allowed to ask Can I just
Yes.
ask one very quick last question just about the males calling? And it's just, I did my PhD on bombino, which is far-bellied toads.
Oh yeah,
and,
of course, yeah.
And so they have huge male choruses where the males are calling in synchrony. But from what you were saying with your guys, it was more like a kind of conversation of somebody did some chucks and then somebody else responded. So is that a completely different scenario of that they're each calling independently and wanting to sound different from the other guy? Or do you get them calling in choruses as well?
Well, they will alternate their calls. They call antiphonally with the males that are next to them. But then as the chorus gets larger, there then becomes a lot of overlap. But their perceptual neighborhood is only a few frogs, even though you might see a lot of frogs. But bombina, I've been in bombina choruses, and you know, they're one of the few frogs that call by inhaling
Ah,
as
not
opposed to
realize.
exhaling.
Okay.
Is that weird? I mean, there's no reason why you can't do, well, obviously they can do it, but instead of, yeah, they do it on the inhale. I have no idea where that comes from, but
It
yeah,
sounds like a
that
perfect anecdote for Austin, Texas.
exactly. But that would make it much more difficult, I would think, for the females.
Yeah, I mean, they produce this enormous sound that you can hear from kilometers away. And then once you're actually in amongst it, it's really difficult to tell who's calling from where.
But you know what happens when they call? You make ripples on the water surface. So we know with the tungur frogs, not with the females yet, but the males pay attention to those ripples to isolate their competitors. So it's possible that with bombina, that there might be something similar.
Yeah, because the other thing I was wondering with this is how much of it is intrasexual signaling as well as female preference. You know, it's males signaling to the guy next door that I'm bigger or more dominant than you. Yeah.
Oh, those are such cool frogs. Good for you. That must have been fun.
That was great, yeah.
All right. Again, thanks so much, Mike. I hope I get to see you in Germany one of these days.
Yeah. Hopefully I'll see you in Sevizen.
That would be fantastic. Thank you to everyone else for coming along. And don't forget, in beginning of July, we have a talk by Doug Emlin talking about the evolution of weapons. And I'm sure
that'll be fun.
Yeah, I think so. Lots of cool pictures of crazy beetles and all kinds of things, and a little bit of the history of war and humans and everything blended together. So come back for that talk. But today is about Mike, and thank you so much for talking to us, Mike.
And thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Okay, bye-bye.
Cheers.